My grandparents lived in a remote village in Japan, surrounded by ancient forests and whispered legends. Every summer, my parents would take me there, a place where time seemed to stand still. The air was always filled with the scent of pine trees and the distant sound of flowing streams. My grandparents' home was old, with wooden beams that creaked under the weight of history, and a large backyard that seemed to stretch into the wilderness. I was their only grandchild, and they adored me, showering me with love and attention. I remember how they would always greet me with warm smiles and small, thoughtful gifts. An intricately carved wooden toy, a beautifully painted fan. But there was something different about that summer when I was 8 years old. A shadow hung over the warmth of their welcome. Something unspoken, yet felt in the air. The journey to their village was always the same. My parents would book a flight, and we'd drive from the airport, winding through narrow roads flanked by tall, silent trees. This time, after a few days, my parents decided to take a trip to another part of Japan, leaving me with my grandparents. It was supposed to be a peaceful, carefree time, but instead, it became the beginning of a nightmare. One hot afternoon, I was playing alone in the backyard, under the watchful eye of the towering trees. The sun beat down relentlessly, and I lay on the grass, letting the warmth lull me into a state of relaxation. The sky above was a clear, brilliant blue, dotted with a few lazy clouds drifting by. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of cicadas. Everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. As I stood up, stretching my arms, I heard something that didn't belong. It was a low, muttering sound, like someone whispering to themselves in a deep male voice. It kept repeating, the sound strange and unsettling. I froze, my eyes darting around the yard, trying to locate the source. Then, at the far end of the yard, something caught my eye. There, perched on top of the high wooden fence that separated the yard from the dense forest beyond, was a straw hat. But it wasn't just lying there, it was moving. Someone was wearing it. The hat bobbed slowly, rhythmically, as if the person wearing it was pacing back and forth behind the fence. I squinted, trying to make out who it was, but the sun's glare made it difficult. Then suddenly, the figure stopped at a gap in the fence. I saw her face. It was a woman, but something about her was horribly wrong. The fence was nearly 2.5 meters tall, yet her face was perfectly visible above it. She was impossibly tall, towering over the fence as if it were a mere obstacle. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she continued walking, disappearing from view, along with that strange muttering sound. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran back into the house, desperate to tell my grandparents what I had seen. They were in the kitchen, quietly sipping tea. I burst in, breathless, and tried to explain what had just happened. At first, they didn't seem to pay much attention, until I mentioned the sound. As soon as the words left my mouth, their faces changed. My grandmother's hand trembled as she placed her teacup down, and my grandfather's eyes widened in horror. The room, once warm and inviting, now felt cold and oppressive. My grandfather stood up abruptly, his face serious and pale. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight, and demanded to know exactly what I had seen.
How tall was she? Where was she standing? What did she do?
His voice was sharp, almost frantic, as he fired off question after question. I answered as best as I could, but the fear in my voice only seemed to deepen his worry. Without another word, he rushed to the hallway and made a phone call, speaking in hushed, urgent tones that I couldn't quite hear. My grandmother remained at the table, her face ashen, her hands clutching the edges of her chair as if she might fall off. The air in the room was thick with a tension I didn't understand. When my grandfather returned, a woman accompanied him. She was a middle-aged woman with a stern face and an aura of authority that made me uneasy. She introduced herself as Kase-san and handed me a small, crumpled piece of paper. Her eyes bore into mine as she instructed me to hold onto it tightly and never let go, no matter what happened. Then, she and my grandfather hurried upstairs, leaving me alone with my grandmother, who was visibly shaken. I sat there in silence, clutching the piece of paper, trying to make sense of what was happening. When I finally worked up the courage to ask my grandmother who Hachishakusama was, she stiffened. Her voice quivered as she tried to reassure me. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Grandpa will protect you." But her words were hollow, and the fear in her eyes told me otherwise. She explained in a trembling voice that Hachishakusama was a dangerous entity that had been haunting the area for generations. It was named 8 feet tall because of its height, an unnatural, towering figure that could appear as different people, but was always terrifyingly tall and had that unmistakable deep male voice. No one knew where it came from or what it truly was, but those who saw it were doomed to die within days. My heart raced as she told me how the villagers had once managed to trap Hachishakusama using small statues of gods called Jizo, placing them in the 4 cardinal directions to imprison it in some ruins outside the village. But somehow, it had escaped, and the last time it appeared was 15 years ago. The fear in my grandmother's voice made the story feel all too real, and I started to shake uncontrollably. When my grandfather and Kase-san came back downstairs, they moved with a sense of urgency. They took me to a bedroom on the 2nd floor, where the windows were covered with old newspapers, inscribed with ancient characters. 4 small bowls of salt were placed in the corners of the room, and a small Buddha statue sat in the middle on a wooden box. A light blue bucket was in one corner. When I asked about it, my grandfather's reply was grim. "It's for you to use as a toilet." Kase-san tucked me into bed, her expression serious and somber. She explained that I had to stay in this room until 7 a.m., no matter what. "You must not leave this room under any circumstances," she instructed, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Your grandparents won't call you or talk to you until then. Do not open this door for any reason." My grandfather added, "And never let go of the paper she gave you. If anything happens, pray and hold on to it with all your strength." With those final words, they left, closing and locking the door behind them. I was alone, surrounded by the eerie silence of the night, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned on the TV, hoping to distract myself, but nothing could ease the fear that had settled deep inside me. The snacks and rice balls left for me on the table went untouched as I stared at the flickering screen, too terrified to move. Time dragged on, and eventually, exhaustion overtook me. I fell into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake in the middle of the night by a soft tapping sound on the window. My blood ran cold as I sat up, my eyes fixed on the dark silhouette outside the window. The tapping continued, persistent and deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the wind, but the sound was too rhythmic, too intentional. I turned up the volume on the TV, hoping to drown out the noise, but it did little to soothe my nerves. The tapping eventually stopped. Then I heard something far more terrifying. My grandfather's voice calling out to me from the hallway.
"Are you there, sweetheart?"
he asked, his voice gentle, yet unnerving.
"If you're scared, I can come in and keep you company."
I almost jumped out of bed to open the door, but something held me back. There was something off about his voice, something that sent chills down my spine. It was too calm, too insistent. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, my heart racing. Then I noticed the bowls of salt in the corners of the room. The once pure white salt had turned black. My heart stopped, and I knew without a doubt that whatever was calling to me was not my grandfather. I knelt before the Buddha statue, clutching the crumpled paper tightly in my hand, and began to pray. Tears streaming down my face as the knocking on the door grew louder, more desperate. The hours dragged by in a haze of fear and prayer. The knocking continued, relentless, but I didn't dare move. The only thing keeping me from succumbing to the terror was the belief that if I stayed in the room and followed the instructions, I might survive. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first light of dawn began to filter through the newspapers, covering the windows. The knocking ceased, and the oppressive silence returned. It was 7 a.m. With trembling hands, I opened the door, and there stood my grandmother and Kase-san, their faces etched with relief. My grandmother hugged me tightly, her body shaking with sobs as she whispered, "Thank God you're safe." They hurried me downstairs, where my parents were waiting, their faces pale and drawn. My grandfather was already outside, loading our luggage into a black van. The urgency in their movements was palpable as they guided me out of the house, where a small group of villagers had gathered, whispering amongst themselves. We climbed into the van, which was filled with men I didn't recognize, but they all had the same grim determination on their faces. Kasa-san sat in the front passenger seat, turning to me with a serious expression. "You must keep your head down and your eyes closed," she instructed. "No matter what you hear or feel, do not open your eyes until we tell you it's safe." The van began to move, crawling at first, then accelerating as we left the village behind. The air inside was thick with tension, so heavy it felt like I could hardly breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears, as I clutched the crumpled paper tighter. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Kasa-san's muttered prayers, her voice growing louder and more urgent as we neared a bend in the road. Old sweat trickled down my back, and I shivered, despite the warmth of the cramped space. Then I heard it. The same deep male voice I had heard in the yard. My heart pounded as I squeezed my eyes shut, holding the paper tightly against my chest. I could feel a cold presence pressing in on the van, and then, through the thin veil of my eyelids, I saw it. A flash of white, like a billowing dress. Hachishakusama was following us. The men in the van began to chant softly, their voices merging with Kasa-san's prayers. The atmosphere grew more intense as the knocking started again, this time on the windows of the van. My whole body shook with fear as I clung to the paper, praying that we would make it through this nightmare. The knocking continued, relentless and terrifying, until suddenly it stopped. The oppressive presence lifted, and the van came to a halt. Kase-san turned to us and said, "I think we're safe now." The men got out, and I was quickly transferred to my parents' car. My mother hugged me tightly, tears streaming down her face as she whispered reassurances into my ear. As we drove away, I looked back at the van and saw my grandparents bowing deeply to the men who had helped us. They had risked everything to protect me, and I would never forget the terror of that night. Even after we arrived safely at the airport and boarded the plane, the fear lingered. My father, sitting beside me, explained that Hachishakusama had been targeting children for generations. It was said to be a vengeful spirit, one that could take on the appearance of loved ones to lure its victims to their doom. The men in the van were all blood relatives, which was why they had surrounded me, to protect me from its influence. As the plane took off, I finally began to relax. But the memory of those terrifying hours stayed with me. I hadn't seen my grandparents since then, and the years that followed were marked by a lingering fear that one day Hachishakusama would return. 2 years ago, my grandfather passed away. His last wish was that I not attend his funeral, fearing that my presence might attract Hachishakusama once more. It broke my heart, but I respected his wish, understanding that even in death, he was trying to protect me from the lingering curse. And then, just a few days ago, I received a call from my grandmother. She told me she was dying of cancer and wanted to see me one last time. "Is it safe now?" I asked, fear creeping into my voice. "Yes, it's been so long. I'm home," she reassured me. But when I mentioned Hachishakusama, the line went silent. The warmth in my grandmother's voice vanished, replaced by a cold, eerie stillness. Then through the static, a different voice came through, deep and unnatural. It wasn't my grandmother anymore. It was Hachishakusama.
"It's okay, sweetheart. Come home."
Thanks for watching. If you felt that chill in the air, don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay safe, and see you in the next video.